in India, my grandparents, they were refugees. They came from Pakistan after the partition with India in 1947. Um, so I was raised in Saudi till 9, and then I went back to India and to boarding school, and then I moved to Canada at 18 for college. An interesting story about Canada. So, English is not my first language, and coming to Canada, the big shock was the language. And I remember my first day in college at orientation when everyone was calling each other "Hey," and I'm like, why are they calling each other grass? Does this mean we have to call professors teacher like trees? Oh my God. I'm so glad I never asked anyone that question. But anyhow, I was so I moved to Canada at 18. Thankfully, I blended in and settled there. So that's my country of citizenship. I was in audit. I was a manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Wrote standards for Canada. Taught audit at U of T, University of Toronto, and then I get a call from the UN. And the current Secretary General is hired, and one of his big portfolios is to reform the UN, specifically the financial reforms of the UN. And Trump was elected as president at the same time. So one of his mandates was, of course, to make sure the U.S. that puts 25% of UN bill, that's $10 billion, they get the most out of it, and things are done in the best way possible. So I was hired. I started December 2016, and I when I joined the UN, I had I didn't know much about the UN. Like I was like everyone else who was like, wow, UN, castle on the hill, what a privilege to be joining the UN. And when I joined the UN, I think that's when I realized what it looks from the outside is not what it is from the inside. And and I think just those educational moments I had on what the UN is what triggered me to run for the position. I think just simple things like there are two UNs that a lot of people don't know about. So one UN is the decision making UN, which we've all heard in the news, right? Security Council decision, General Assembly, like the traffic in New York in September. Um, but then there's a UN that implements the decision, and that is the role of the Secretary General. And that's where I see a lot of shortcomings. And I think let me give you a couple examples. Um, for every dollar the UN receives, and they have a budget of over 50 billion, only 30 cents is used for the cause. And we have record number of refugees in the world and displaced people, and that's 85 million. These are people who are not voters in any countries. They are not someone who have social media to tell their stories, and they have been in lockdowns for decade on end. Like the lockdown that we've gone through for 1 year has been so stressful now, but we all knew we would come out of it. Now imagine being a refugee in Syria, Somalia for 3 decades, Libya for a decade, and no end in sight. So for me, those are things that we really need to prioritize and address. Human suffering has to end, and we need to use our resources efficiently. And with that being said, we need to also strategically decide where we want to get involved in. For example, climate change. We all know climate change is critical and the most important threat to our existence. For every dollar the UN receives, which is like $3 billion, only 15 cents is used for nature-based solutions, which is like actually that's things that are going to combat climate change. Everything else is like conferences, writing reports, talking, and I'm like, what's there to talk about? Like, let's put the money back. So, in short, those are the challenges, and then I'd be happy to go into the solutions.
Aurora, that's what does the UN typically do on a daily basis? And I'm asking that honestly because I don't necessarily know. Even though I know ideally it's supposed to be a force for good in the world, a force for kind of a forum for nations to be able to interact and everything else.
Yeah,
But like you said, all things being equal, you would want it to be a force to combat human suffering. And is
absolutely.
it that now or it's not that now? Meaning it's not what it purports to be in this case. And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so I think let's go back. That's such a great question, by the way. I'm so glad you asked because it's a good foundation for the discussion. So let's go back into history. UN was formed after World War II, and it's a successor to the previous international organization called League of Nations. League of Nations was the first attempt to create an international body. Um, Woodrow Wilson was the one who actually wrote the first draft of the Covenant of League of Nations, but US didn't sign it. So when UN Charter was being designed, the founding documents were the League of Nations Covenant. And the member states, there were 51 member states who said, like, you know what, World War II, we couldn't prevent World War II, but we must prevent World War III. We must come together, work work as a group, and let's do this differently than what we did previously. So what did they learn in doing things differently? They said that we need to make decisions collectively. So decision making is one of the UN's objective as the world, all countries come together and make decisions, pass policies, and those decisions are in the area of peace and security, which is the most important because we don't want a third world war, and that happens in the Security Council. In League of Nations, we didn't have a Security Council. There was just one decision-making body that made decisions on every area. Oh, should we have a bridge here? Should we spend $5 billion here? Or, I mean, not 5 billion at that time. So it was one decision-making body. But this time they said, no, peace and security is so critical. It must have its own decision-making body, hence the Security Council. And the founders, of course, at that time took the veto power. Then you have other decision-making bodies called General Assembly and Economic and Social Commission. They pass decision. So Sustainable Development Goals is something that was passed through the Economic and Social Commission. So this is called the decision-making body of the UN. But then there's one thing that member states learned is that you cannot expect UN to achieve its goals if it doesn't implement those decisions, right? Talking doesn't do anyone any good. So that is where there's a UN called Secretariat, and Secretary General is the head of that entity that was created. So the UN that you're talking about, like, what does it do? So it passes all these decisions, but someone has to implement them, right? Like we have a decision to take care of humanitarian needs of all the people. Who's supposed to implement it? UN does it. And how do we do it? When someone is a refugee, we make sure that their basic humanitarian needs are being met: food, clothing, shelter, security. And then we try to work on solutions on how do we get them out of here. So that is repatriation. You repatriate them back to where they came. You reintegrate them, or you resettle them. So in terms of that implementing aspect, they do a lot of things in that, from refugees to development to human rights issues as well. And there are almost close to 100 UN entities in the system. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I know.
I think so.
I think
Yeah.
that was quite good. Yeah, thank you. And for those listening, we're joined by Aurora Akanksha. She's a 34-year-old audit coordinator at the UN who has announced her candidacy to challenge incumbent UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in the United Nations leadership selection taking place later this year. If she's selected, she'd be the youngest ever and first female Secretary General of the UN. Aurora, I want to turn, this is a slightly broader question. I want to get back, we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to get back after we pose this to what specifically you're proposing, but just briefly, broadly looking at this, do you see the UN as an independent body from any collective of nations, or is it a sort of constituent assembly representing the interest? If you, almost on a philosophical level, I guess where I'm going with this question is, it seems like the fate of the world in terms of what any individual country wants is more at odds than it's been in at least a couple of decades, and arguably a bit longer than that, with a vision of a unipolar world order versus a multipolar world order. When you're looking at the relationship specifically between the United States and China and Russia, whether it's geopolitics, whether we're talking geopolitically about what the world is going to look like, or whether we're talking about climate change, as you were mentioning earlier, different countries have different takes on what this is supposed to look like. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, looking at the UN as a body, is it independent from the rest of countries? Does it have its own sort of organizational weight or heft, or is it merely a representation of the consensus that other countries can come to, that individual countries around the world achieve through a process of deliberation in the UN? I hope that question makes sense. What's your take on it, Aurora?
It's a great question, and it makes complete sense. So your question on, like, what is it an independent or just a coalition of a few countries? So the UN, like I said, it has a decision-making component which is entirely driven by the member states. The member states are the one who pass decisions, but they don't pass decision in isolation. They are supported by research and facts to back their decision, and those research and facts come from their own countries. Like US has its own, Russia has its own, China brings its own, like thought leaders to the table on what they want. But then there is an independent process of giving them facts from academics, civil society, we call it, academics, other neutral think tanks, and they do facilitate a process such that we reach a point that is best for everyone, given the circumstances. Like in Security Council, of course, with the veto, it does follow the process of what the veto country wants. But in General Assembly and Economic and Social Commission, you do see a lot of balanced decision making. And I've personally sat through a lot of decisions, and I can tell you that as much as we think from the outside that countries seek self-interest, or like, they're always looking out for themselves, there is a huge commitment and consistency in ensuring that we are doing good for the world and rising above our self-interest. And I think that doesn't get reflected in meetings, because that doesn't ever make it to news table where they've all agreed and tried to do the right thing. Where they haven't agreed is what makes the headlines. So I think at a philosophical level, it is a platform to allow countries to come together and make decisions collectively as humanity. Like you said, climate change, it'll affect everyone. It doesn't see borders. And the countries have made decisions. And I think what's important, and that I'd like to highlight, is where we haven't done a good job to show the results of the UN is implementation. And I think that's what, for me, like my candidacy is all about. So you can feel the results and not just read about it and be like, oh, this is so abstract, I'm not sure how it affects my life.
Well, go into that
And
for
I
a
think,
moment. I mean, because we have about 2 minutes left. What would you do
yeah,
in regards to, like, because like you say, implementation? What powers does the UN have to affect changes in the way that you want to affect changes? I think that's the question.
uh, yeah, I think that's, so let's, okay, so remember when COVID happened, like the policy decision to create a vaccine was like immediately, right? Would we call that success? No. When when the vaccine was created, would we call that success? No. So we would call our success over COVID when it's been administered in every arm. Like that's a risk factor. So implementation, that's where the importance is. And in terms of power, surprisingly, the Secretary General of the UN has the power to implement decisions in the best way possible. And the way I see the job, for myself, is we need to make sure we first of all prioritize what we're doing, and we need to prioritize human suffering, which is address the growing refugee needs by making sure that we're able to give them their basic humanitarian needs. So currently we're only able to address 50% humanitarian needs of people, like of these 85 billion. So the rest are left to fend for themselves, and they end up being trafficked, smuggled, lured to join terrorist organizations to protect their women and girls. And that needs to stop. And that can stop with a simple decision to prioritize resources to get there. We can, of course, do things more efficiently, get innovation and technology. And then when it comes to climate change, youth unemployment is an issue that impacts every country in the world. I see that as a huge opportunity to allow them to be involved in combating climate change by getting action done on the ground. Like we can engage with them in cleaning our seas, our oceans, and doing all the great work that needs to be done to combat climate change. So I want UN to be the largest employer for young people. Um, we can invest in internet and education. Today, only half of the world has access to internet, and we've landed on Mars. If all of us had it, we'd be living on Pluto. And development over the last 40 years has followed like a Reaganomics model of like trickle down. You give it to the top, hope that it'll go to the bottom, and it hasn't worked. So let's just invest in the bottom, which is giving them the 21st century tools, universal internet access, and universal online education. So sky is the limit for their potential.
We have to take you out, but I love this because I think you're absolutely right. Human suffering should be prioritized. I think we have a different world if human suffering was prioritized. I think less chaos, less violence, less refugees, less etc. So I wish you the best on this. Aurora, Kosh. Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. Aurora Akanksha is a 34-year-old audit coordinator at the UN who has announced her candidacy to challenge incumbent UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in the 2021 United Nations leadership selection. She is the first woman and first millennial candidate for the position and the first known candidate to challenge an incumbent. Good on you. If selected, Aurora will be the youngest ever first female Secretary General of the UN in 75-year history. You can follow Aurora on Twitter at Aurora4People and learn more about her campaign at aurora4sg.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the one and only Chris Williamson.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people.
And they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient,
No, Chris.
distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
No, Chris.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are waiting right now for our guest. Hopefully he'll be on pretty soon. And we're going to have a conversation about a professor in a professor in the UK that is basically, I'll just say it. Bristol Uni professor David Miller is under police investigation due to remarks that he has been making. Some of those remarks, such as, let's see, right here. He called for an end to Zionism, as well as claiming, quote, it's fundamental to Zionism to encourage Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism to, unquote. On Thursday, 18th of February, he doubled down on his comments while claiming that a student involved in, quote, political surveillance, unquote, against him and that attacks on him are directed by the state of Israel, which has resulted in online abuse of Jewish students. Now, free speech is not a law in the UK. And as such, this professor, like I said, is under criminal investigation. When our guests come on, I would love to have a conversation with him about it because he himself was under a huge amount of persecution with this basically campaigns to undermine and destroy people by saying they're anti-Semitic. Yeah, by going after people and saying they were anti-Semitic. Okay, so I don't know if our guests will be coming on. So let's just talk about it, Shane. Have you had an opportunity to read through the story?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. The free speech thing is bothersome to me. Look, we know that Jeremy Corbyn has been under this. We know Chris Williamson himself has been under this. And basically, you have this situation where people will be denigrated and called racist, well, in this case, anti-Semitic, by continuously attacking the person. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant, and it becomes a political hit job. And that basically is what took place to our missing guests. But it is also now taking place to this professor. Just because a professor makes an argument that says that these guys are going after him, and by the way, I don't know if people have seen the film The Lobby, but The Lobby makes that point very clear that the Israeli lobby is very focused on going after political opposition and political opponents. And if it means calling somebody who's anti-Semitic, who's not anti-Semitic, they will do so in a heartbeat, purely for political effect. And look, that's what it seems like on some level is happening to this professor. Also, this conflation of Zionism with Jewish is weird, and yet it keeps being done. At some level, you can understand why. Israel is a state, just like any other state. But if you can associate it as a Jewish state in this kind of weird apartheid fashion, then you can push back against political opponents that are attacking your state as being racist. By the same token, if you make that conflation, you can't get mad when people start making these conflations between the state of Israel and the behavior of Jews in various countries. Now, that conflation, however, is inspired by doing that, the Jewish state stuff. Does that make sense, Shane? I'm hoping I'm making sense on this. Attacking a state is attacking a state. It is not attacking a nationality or a race, if that makes sense. Any state can take an action that is horrific, and that state can be criticized as such. Calling yourself a Jewish state does not absolve you of criticism, nor does it have anything to do with you being, quote unquote, Jewish. This professor who's saying Zionism needs to be ended, or making a point of saying, hey, there are people who are going after me. Well, the film, The Lobby, the UK variation and the United States variation makes it very clear that that is entirely within the realm of possibility. What are your thoughts, Shane?
I mean, at a certain point, it can become anti-Semitic, but you shouldn't make that claim. That claim should not be considered meritorious. It shouldn't be given credit until, it's true. It's demonstrably true. And no, any criticism of Israel, the country, is not a criticism of Judaism or of Jews. Very simply, we've had Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro on this show somewhat frequently. Every once in a while, we bring him on to talk about this stuff. He is a rabbi again, and he's pissed at Israel and has been over the long term, as are many Orthodox Jews, because basically they've created a new Jewish ethnic identity as a weird ethnic nationalist grouping with, religious overtones. But in the new identity, you can be an atheistic Jew, which, as far as I know, in Rabbi Shapiro's perspective, is ridiculous. Judaism, first and foremost, was and is a religion, and in a way, you're tarnishing what it means to be a Jew. You're muddying that, certainly making the definition less clear, but also arguably making the definition worse by associating it with the state of Israel and by saying any Jew not only has a right to citizenship in Israel, but any Jew, frankly, is Jewish by the fact that they are Israeli instead of by the fact that they are a devout or practicing Jew. This is a long-term thing, and it's admittedly thorny territory because you can't get into this conversation, as far as I can tell, without going up to the main reason that we are so critical of anti-Semitism, which is, of course, the Holocaust and the history of persecution against Jews. But at the same time, if Israel is responsible for its own apartheid system, if Israel is responsible for its own persecution of another ethnic minority, this is where the rubber has to meet the road. And you have to get into a little bit more nuance than just any criticism of practicing Jews or non-practicing Jews in the state of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism, because it isn't. Otherwise, you're putting on a huge blinder, and I'm worried that the backlash will be worse if you keep that blinder on. I'm worried that you make a lot of people actual anti-Semites if you call them that label merely for criticizing the country, and that's sort of the hidden part of the iceberg that I think asserts itself in the long haul. Yeah, I mean that's again a sort of simple take on it, partly derived from Rabbi Shapiro's speech and his ideas and what he's come to us to say. But I think he makes a lot of sense, and frankly, it's rare but good to hear that kind of conversation happening on this issue, because I think that I'll put it like this: I like Judaism, probably. I like the Judaic religion. I mean, as far as religions go, I can jive with that one. I like some of the history there. That's just me personally. But I don't like a lot of the stuff that I see the country of Israel doing. And I say this as a non-Jew, never been a Jew, etc. But I really don't like some of the stuff that I see Israel doing. It seems to have gone pretty far to the right, and they seem to have a history of not only invading but occupying other people's countries over the long haul, with the protection, maybe sometimes even at the behest of Western governments, specifically the United States, and certainly under the protection of the United States more recently. And if you look at what could cause a World War III, it seems like Israel, if the World War III is initiated by what's going on in the Middle East, it seems like Israel could be a prime component of that. And therefore, I think we should be able to criticize the country when they misstep, which in my opinion is often these days. Jamarl, what's your take?
Of course, you should be able to criticize a country when they misstep. They're just countries. They're legal fictions. And yeah, the legal fiction stuff, people sometimes, it's being done for political effect. That's the point. And these witch hunts are destroying people for political effect. I think that's what it boils down to. And that's the beginning and end of it. I mean, look, Jeremy Corbyn does not have a racist bone in his body. There's nothing to show for that. And yet, they have screamed and attacked that man to such a degree where they tried to get him out of Parliament. Like, think about that. They have nothing to show for it. And yet they've gone after him, and they're just saying it over and over and over again. And what they would do is they would say, Jeremy Corbyn has been criticized for being anti-Semitic. And then later on, they would say, well, people have criticized him for being anti-Semitic. And then later on, there's been substantial criticism of being anti-Semitic. But there's nothing to substantiate it. They've just said it. And it's like the very act of saying it has perpetuated the ability to continue to say it forward. It's very strange. It's very weird. And let's be very clear. There is a concerted organization of lobbies. I mean, AIPAC is just one of many lobbies. And while they can't necessarily give money directly, that doesn't necessarily stop money from exchanging hands in serendipitous ways to influence political figures. I mean, yeah.
But here's the thing: at the same time, I can hear that, and I can also hear where they could easily criticize what you're saying. And frankly, I agree with you. So I'm not trying to do that. But an argument that would come from the other side on this one, however you want to define that, is this was a trope that was used leading up to and during World War II by the Nazis and other fascist-leaning governments, and frankly, governments around the world, that Jews had an outsized political influence, that kind of thing. You see what I'm saying? And so the moment you start making those arguments, I think what should be made very clear is that those are not Jewish lobbies. Those are Israeli lobbies. Those are lobbies enacted by the government of Israel, which does not identify itself with religious Judaism, hand in glove. You don't have to be a practicing Jew, as was recently certified by the Israeli Supreme Court, in order to attain citizenship. You don't have to be one. There's, in other words, they've sort of severed the linkage at the base, which, if you make that very clear, ideally also makes it clear that you're not an anti-Semite.
Right.
Makes it clear that you're criticizing the decisions made by a nation state, not the decisions made by adherents of a religion, which are their own decisions, and they have every right to make, and I don't think they deserve any persecution. In the same way, of course, that I don't think, Christians or Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus deserve criticism for the decisions that they make as adherents of a religion. That would be ridiculous. That is bigotry at its core.
In
But
retrospect,
criticizing a nation for doing something is not that.
the government had to do that, or the courts had to do that, if you think about it. They had to sever that link, because that gets too weird if you don't sever the link. Meaning, you have to make it clear that this is a religious thing. And if you don't do that, it starts to look very bad. It starts to look very, very bad. I mean, look, my thing is, you can criticize a state for the actions that state makes. And Israel is just a state. No more, no less. It's a legal fiction. It's no different than any other legal fiction. They've made certain policies and they've done certain things that have been ghastly, to put it mildly. And they're worthy, deserving of robust criticism. I mean, for God's sake, it's an apartheid state at this point. But I take your point, Shane. I mean, it's not, it is an Israeli lobby. Yeah, that's fair. But that's kind of gets to my point. The conflation between the two is so close, and that conflation is made by them. They make that conflation, meaning that Israeli lobby makes that conflation with being a Jewish lobby for the very specific point of being able to say, hey, what do you mean you're attacking us for? It's that.
What's so sickening to me about this is that conflation is not good for Judaism. That is not good for the religious adherents, and the most devout of Jews don't like it. We got to go into a break. We're gonna be back in a minute with headlines in another 2 hours of today's show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Welcome back live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched on the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In this corner, I am your ever-vigilant, indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. Having a little internal baseball. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 487 new coronavirus deaths and 45,552 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 63,199 cases per day. an increase of 15% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,285,400 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and about 548,867 have died from it. Now, I think I said roughly 2 or 3 weeks ago that that number was going to go up. And the only reason I said that has to do with spring break and some of these other things. We're opening up schools. We're opening up our economies. People, even though they got the vaccines, those vaccines are not necessarily bulletproof. By the same token, the question really does boil down to, will there be enough vaccines, herd immunity, that will compensate for the opening up and the people who may get sick but may not necessarily overwhelm that number? And that's unclear to me right now. Right now, it looks like the number has bumped up a little bit, but we'll see. I mean, the hope is that that number trends down. My concern is that people, I don't believe we've seen the end of protests. I don't buy it. And I think there's going to be a lot of pent-up energy that's going to get expended the moment that the lockdowns and everything else end. And not just when the lockdowns end, even before they end. Because the protests I think that you're seeing in Europe, on some level you may see here, when you get half of the population that's vaccinated and the other half is not vaccinated, and the half that's vaccinated no longer wants to stay into the house or abide by the restrictions in regards to masks and everything else. And they're talking about putting those restrictions going further into the next year. So we'll see. I could be wrong on that point. I mean, the protest thing may be wrong, but we'll see. Just nail it down that I said it. I make these predictions all the time. Shane tried to undermine my win on this one. And it's not a win because I didn't want the number to go up. All things being equal, I wanted to be wrong on it. But here we are. The Pentagon's top health officials have said that all of the U.S. service personnel and other Defense Department beneficiaries will be eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine starting May 1st. They've predicted that the entire Defense Department staff will be vaccinated by mid-July. The medicines agencies for the European Union have approved 3 new vaccine manufacturing facilities. The facilities in Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland will produce Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna vaccines respectively. The agency has also reported that it will widen the permitted storage conditions for the Pfizer vaccine, which had previously needed to be stored in conditions of negative 70 degrees Celsius. The new conditions for storage and transport range from negative 25 degrees Celsius to negative 15 degrees Celsius, or from negative 13 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's good. I mean, keep in mind, part of the strength of the Russian vaccine, in addition to the low cost, had to do with the storage issues. They didn't necessarily need to be used in that level of cold storage. So when you went into certain countries that didn't have the capacity to keep it in cold storage, they could use that particular vaccine, even though they couldn't use some of the more, the vaccines for some of the other Western countries. Now, by the way, Cuba is apparently bringing out multiple vaccines, and Brazil. We really should talk about Brazil. Brazil is at a point right now where they are being besieged by the virus. And it's gotten to the point where the world is looking at that country and thinking to themselves, oh my God, this could spread into other areas because it is so uncontrolled and it is so rampant, not to mention the variants that are apparently in Brazil at this point. It is notable, it is very notable, that in the Health and Human Services report, I'm not going to forget this because it's so profound in its implications. The idea that we were pushing countries not to use products from other countries that were on our naughty list, or for that matter, not to use doctors from Cuba because, again, they were on our naughty list. And when Joe Biden gets in office, you would think that he would rescind something like that, but once again, he doesn't. When asked, Psaki makes the point this is the problem with the Chinese and the Russian vaccine is that there are no strings attached. What? How's that a problem? How's that a problem? And think to yourself for a moment, what does that mean? What does that mean? The United States hasn't given up any of its vaccines, despite the fact that it's pushing countries to not get help from countries on our naughty list. That's profound. How many people have been injured or died as a result of the actions? And by the way, this goes 2 ways. Lula. We put Lula in prison, or at the very least, we assisted in the putting Lula in prison. Would Lula have taken actions in the same way that Bolsonaro has in regards to being this incompetent, this utterly, flamboyantly stupid in dealing with the vaccine, with the COVID-19 crisis. No, he would not have. And if that's true, how many people in Brazil died as a result of Bolsonaro being in office? And I'll leave it. I guess I'm making the point that the policies has hit that country in two particular ways. One, in putting somebody incompetent in that office. A ham sandwich would have done better than Bolsonaro in staving this off. And two, in pushing that country to not accept assistance from other countries that are on that naughty list. It's profound. After German Chancellor Angela Merkel canceled the country's planned lockdown over Easter, Germany Health Minister Lothar Weidler has now warned that if German residents don't socially distance over the holidays, the country could see its third and most horrific wave yet. Wellier has said that it could be as many as 100,000 infections per day if the spread of the virus isn't slowed. As of last week, the 7-day average of new cases in Germany was just over 15,000 per day, more than double the number reported a month earlier. Keep in mind, it's not just Germany. France, Poland, many other countries in Europe are taking a hit over this. And their ability to distribute the virus or the vaccines have apparently not necessarily gone all that well with this kind of weird vaccine nationalism that is basically taking place. A very strange case in Europe. The U.S. has done much, much better in regards to the vaccine distribution. The Mexican government has published revised figures showing its COVID death toll of 60% higher than previously reported, putting them in excess of 300,000. Wow. And leaving them with the second highest death toll in the world behind the United States. Total excess deaths in Mexico from all cases stood at 417,002 by the end of the 6th week of this year, when recently updated COVID death statistics have shown 294,287 deaths from the virus. Wow, that takes them, well, no, that's not true. Brazil, at this point, is hit 300,000. So unless...
312,000. But if you extrapolate out from the numbers 6 weeks into the year, Mexico would be higher at this point. That's where that comes from.
I see. I see.
They're pretty close, though. They're both low 300,000s.
Yeah. What's the population? I mean, Brazil is a much larger country than Mexico, right? I could be fact-checked on that.
Geographically, yeah, pretty darn sure. In terms of population, I was actually just going to look that up as you asked that question.
I want to say yes. And so for Mexico to be that close, that's astonishing. That's astonishing.
It is. Okay, so Mexico is about 127 million. Brazil is 211 million.
Yeah.
So that's a significant disparity, and the fact that they're so close means that Mexico, in that definition, also is doing a lot worse on a per capita basis. Wow. Relative to the total population, way higher death toll.
Wow, AMLO, what is AMLO doing? What is AMLO doing? You would have thought he would have been more competent. And it might just be an issue of resources. I don't know. That's interesting. I'm very curious as to why and what happened, because Mexico wasn't on the list of countries that were being hit like that. I mean, often many of the governments were right-wing governments. If you look at the UK initially with Bojo talking about herd immunity and then getting sick and coming back out of a changed man. You had the situation in India with Modi. You had it in Bolsonaro and Brazil, Trump in the United States. And so those tend to be the countries that got hit. But what about Mexico? What happened? I'm very curious about that. This is a new story. But let's keep going. Both Republican and Democratic politicians have visited the border last week and over the weekend as scrutiny of the migrant holding facilities has increased over recent weeks. A group of Republican senators led by Ted Cruz visited the border last week, with Cruz sharing a video of himself standing near the banks of the Rio Grande, warning about the flood of cartel-managed human smuggling. Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas led a delegation of 6 Democratic representatives, including Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, to visit Castillo Springs, which is the site of the Department of Health and Human Services holding facility for up to 1,000 children between the ages of 13 to 17 who cross the border without a parent or a guardian. The topic of growing migrant crisis took center stage during the presidential debate during the first presidential conference Thursday. So this one is very interesting. Now, Joe Biden keeps making this argument, and I think he misses the point that people are making here. Look, I understand that the media wants to lavish themselves in this. If it bleeds, it leads. And the fact that kids are suffering, even better. It makes it a story. The American public doesn't entirely like this notion of the border being porous or being open. And if it seems that if the Democratic president is basically creating a situation that allows it, they're not going to like the fact that he's doing that. That is explicitly why Republicans are going to the border and pointing at Joe Biden saying he did this. Now, the thing is, the moment that people believe that their kids are going to be allowed, it will incentivize. I don't know how Joe Biden thinks that that is not the case. Also, if you really want to stop people coming here, stop instigating yourselves into their countries. Media cannot really have that conversation. Media doesn't quite bring that up. And for all of the talk that America learns from its mistakes, Bolivia. I mean, we are right now acting as if a government that is putting people in prison as a result of a coup, a violent coup that took place where people were killed in massacres. Our government is acting as if they're turning towards authoritarianism because America backed that coup, just like we backed the one in Honduras, just like we backed putting Lula in prison. I'm making a point that if indeed we learn from our mistakes in the way that Psaki said, why are we continuing to push for these coups? If Honduras, 80% of the cocaine goes through Honduras. Zelais, the one that we got rid of, the partner, Hernandez, is the guy who's being implicated in that. I'm making the point that it was the coup that instigated that behavior, and we have yet to stop doing that. So it's like we're angry at the migrants coming here. By the same token, we have no issue or compunction undermining their countries when it suits our interests, when we want to get our hand on a particular resource or we don't like a particular person that's in office. And the consequences of that has a certain blowback with people coming to our border wanting to come in. Joe Biden takes an ethical choice. Not ethical in the sense of not kicking over countries, but ethical in the sense of saying, look, if a kid comes here, I'm going to keep him. Fair enough. Fair enough. But that does mean that they're going to bring their kids here. And it also means that that is not a policy that Trump had. Just making that point. The judge allowed Trump to push those kids back in Mexico, I believe the deal was. The deal broke down between the United States and Mexico, and Joe Biden said, I'm not going to send the kids back. Fair enough. But let's just admit and accept that that is your fault then, even if the choice is ethical. Does that make sense, Shane? An ethical choice doesn't make it, doesn't mean that things are going to be lovely and go well for you. Sometimes it is painful taking an ethical choice. But again, it's ethical for a particular reason. What's your note, Shane? I mean, if you want to mention this one.
I mean, I'm too young to speak authoritatively about what it means to make difficult decisions as a person leading a state. But yeah, that rings true. I mean, this is history is rife with examples of politicians, or frankly, people on any level of political authority, having to make difficult decisions where you have a hard time telling what the right thing to do is, and yet you need to make a decision. And any decision you make, the worst of all evils, that kind of thing. You're having to choose between different sacrifices that you're having to make. On the general level, that's the case here. We're pretty close to out of time.
Yeah, we can close it. Look, I just hate the fact that they're bathing in the blood of these migrants. I hate the fact that we are kicking over these governments and then acting shocked when the governments are set on fire.
But I hate that fact too, but here's one last point on that. But we're hearing about it. So whether it's a political, I guess it's better this being made a political football in its own way, because at least it becomes a topic of conversation and something that the administration has to address meaningfully, ideally, than if we were stuck debating like Harry and Meghan with like for whatever reason else that happened. You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, but the way they talk about it is they drop so much context. Like think about the way they've asked questions on this. Have you ever heard them ask questions in a context where they've instigated the notion of knocking over governments? No. They talk about it like the governments are just basket cases.
And I doubt that Ted Cruz like weeps for every abuelita who's suffers the worst effects of her grandchildren coming to the border. It's not like he doesn't have a lot of this, of course, is theater, but politics is theater, just in general, but particularly in a democracy like ours. And it's what you get. It's what you get with it. Hopefully, and this is the final hope, they actually do something that's useful for resolving the situation, including some serious introspection on what we do overseas, all the coups and such.
Oh God, that's not happening. Yeah, okay. And I think you're being facetious, but fair enough. Where are you?
I said hopefully. I said hopefully. I'm not
okay,
saying
fair enough.
Fair enough.
That
is the hope.
Fair enough. Those are your headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to give us or join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So, an interesting story that is coming out of the Prospect, that is basically, well, the American Prospect, that is making the point about how we've been dumping money into companies that are working abroad, that are basically dumping money into what we consider to be terrorist organizations that we are supposed to be fighting against. It's a very strange situation, but I remember Fox News ran something of a similar story a while back when it wanted to take a pound of flesh out of Obama. And it basically got in contact with people who were dumping money, we were dumping money into Syria. And they would be transporting weapons, but they would have to pay off terrorist groups just to get the weapons transported to wherever they were trying to get it to. Well, it sounds something similar to this, where the companies, in order to basically operate in that country, has to kind of pay money. It's almost like a mafia ring. It is very strange, very interesting, and on some level makes a certain kind of sense if you think about it. To have a conversation about this and to get a little bit more context, we're joined by Caleb Maupin. He's speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of a changing U.S. political discourse and geopolitical stage. Caleb, thank you for joining us. How you doing?
I'm good. How about yourself?
We're doing okay. Are you feeling better? I know you were under the weather at some point. And so, we were all horrified by it. And I'm being serious. It was like, oh God, no way. Is he okay? It was one of those type of moments. But how are you doing? Are you doing all right now?
I'm great. I feel great. All is good, and I'm cleared. I'll be back at work soon, and I'm very happy. Yeah. All is good here in the Big Apple.
Excellent. Excellent. So I want to get into this article by the American Prospect, or prospect.org. Um, we are paying companies that are basically, I don't know if people know this, but a lot of the military is basically contractors now. We pay companies to go and do certain things. And in those companies being there, in order for those companies to operate without necessarily being attacked or being hit, they have to basically pay money to various organizations and businesses that are basically mobbed up and connected to give them somewhat of a pass of operation in the country. Am I explaining this correctly? I mean, this is kind of wild.
Well, I mean, a similar thing happened in Afghanistan. It was revealed that, that the U.S. military and U.S. military contractor companies were paying lots of money to, like, the Taliban and groups in Afghanistan, and that this is, kind of the nature of how things have been going down. Now, that particular article, when you talk about Iraq, the issue with Iraq is that it's not really clear, and the U.S. government is not really clear about who their enemies are in Iraq, right? ISIS is obviously, a menace that is, kidnapping people and torturing them and cutting people's heads off. But the main enemy of ISIS tends to be these Shia militias in Iraq that are sympathetic to the government, that are aligned with the Iraqi government, but are also sympathetic to Iran and aligned with Iran. They fight ISIS. They protect the Shia communities of Iraq from the Wahhabi extremists of ISIS and other organizations that might have ties to Saudi Arabia that are engaged in sectarian warfare. The Iraqi government supports them. However, under Donald Trump and increasingly and continuing under Joe Biden, the U.S. government seems to also think these Iranian-backed groups are also enemies of the United States. So we're in Iraq, and it's not clear who exactly are our friends and who exactly are our enemies. If ISIS and Al Qaeda and groups like that are our enemies, then we should be getting along with the Iraqi government. We should be getting along with Shia militias that are aligned with the Iraqi government that get support from Iran. But if they're our enemies, then would that make ISIS our allies? Like, it's not exactly clear. The United States isn't clear about what it really wants in Iraq and who it really supports. And I think that's the issue, because every Iraqi administration since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein has ended up more or less getting friendlier with Iran. They come into office, they say, oh, we're not going to have anything to do with Iran. But as the country, continues to get worse, and as it becomes clear that they need allies, Iran is bordering Iraq. Iran very much wants Iraq to be more stable because of the fact that it's right on their border. Iran is a Shia country. Iraq is a Shia majority country. And so basically the Iraqi government, by default, becomes friendly to Iran, starts getting, into an alliance with Iran and Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. And as a result, the United States becomes very frustrated and becomes, more critical of the Iraqi government because we don't like Iran. So it's really not clear. What is our goal in Iraq? Who are our friends? Who are our enemies? It's not even really clear. And so, of course, you got U.S. military contractors that don't quite know that either. And I think that's the situation the article was pointing toward.
Well, and if we got involved in Iraq for a reason other than merely fighting George Bush's vendetta on behalf of his father, what would that reason be? The neocons made the argument about nation building and against building up, along the sort of Huntingtonian clash of civilizations lines, building up a bulwark for our kind of democracy in the Middle East, alongside, Israel to keep a sort of flag in the ground there and to push back against ideological, religious, and cultural elements we don't like. And first and foremost, in the real politics sense, trying to fight back against our stated enemies. But like you say, if every administration that has come in Iraq since our invasion of the country has tended over time to lean towards Iran, and we keep trying to keep them from doing that, what is the point here? Could we have not seen this coming? And where do you think American foreign policy, in its sort of fragmented state, is trying to take us in the future? Is there a coherent vision here, Caleb? And if so, what do you think it is?
Well, if you look at Iraq, we certainly haven't been successful in terms of nation building. I mean, Iraq is far less stable now than it was under Saddam Hussein. Living standards have gone down. There's far more chaos in the country. I mean, it certainly hasn't, been built up as a nation. I argue that what's going on is that the United States basically doesn't want competitors on the international markets. Iraq, just like Libya before the 2011, NATO-led, destruction of Libya, was an independent socialist country that was selling oil on the international markets. And every barrel of oil that the Ba'ath Socialist government of Iraq sold was a barrel of oil that people didn't buy from ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. And that Iraq was a competitor. It was a competitor with, American oil companies. And now, as a competitor, it's been blown off the market. Iraqi oil exports are barely 10% of what they were under Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, Iraq is very, very unstable. You have, different ethnic groups and, religious groups in the country fighting each other. And that instability has spilled over into other countries throughout the region. That instability spilled over into Syria, where you have another Ba'ath socialist government that is, a competitor with the United States, fighting a civil war, and that this is about removing competition with Western corporations. They want to reduce Iraq to instability and chaos so that Western corporations can dominate. Look, if you look at the countries the United States tends to target, they're countries that have broken out of Western dominance. They've broken kind of free of the dominance of Western corporations. They've started, exporting oil on the international markets or building themselves up. Iran is a major oil exporting country. Russia is a major oil and natural gas exporting country. Venezuela is a major oil exporting country. And we tend to not want competitors. Look, I mean, back when China was the sick man of Asia, the U.S. Had no problem with China when it was a deeply poor country. But now that China has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, now that it's become a major industrial production hub with its own manufacturing, people around the world are doing business with China instead of doing business with American companies. They're a competitor. It's about removing competitors from the global market, clearing the market with chaos.
And by the way, Joe Biden says something similar when he's like, we're going to compete. And it's like, well, you're not really talking about competing in the sense of just the capitalistic competing. You're talking about, Huawei, for example, in the UK. UK wanted it. The US pressures them, says, don't take it. Like, that's not competition. That's just pressuring using your political ties. Same thing with India. Putting sanctions on India, putting sanctions on Turkey because they're using Russian-made weapon systems that are cheaper and work apparently just as well. It's like, how are you sanctioning? It's almost as if the moment that the capitalistic competition thing became too difficult, at that point, military or sanctions came into play as being viable means of quote-unquote competition. It's astonishing. 30 seconds, Caleb. I mean, is that correct in the way that I'm thinking about this?
Oh, absolutely. And it's the same thing we're doing with Germany and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, trying to force the Germans to import their natural gas all the way from the United States when they're about to complete a natural gas pipeline with Russia.
Yeah, they're like 90% almost complete that pipeline, and we're still screaming that the pipeline is a bad deal. And Germany needs that gas, by the way. It would be weird for them to ignore their own foreign policy interests, and yet that's what the U.S. wants. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise in prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Caleb is coming right back with us. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about whether turnabout is fair play in the case of human rights allegations being made first by the United States against China and now by China against the United States, as the People's Republic of China's State Council Information Office has released the report on human rights violations in the United States in 2020. Again, to set the backdrop here, although many listening will already know this, For years now, and increasingly recently, the United States has made a big deal out of the Uyghur population, making claims as high as genocide. Specifically, Secretary of State Pompeo under the Trump administration, more recently Secretary of State Antony Blinken under the Biden administration, have both signed on to a claim that China is guilty of committing a genocide against its Uyghur population in its Xinjiang region. As we were talking about in headlines this morning, and as has become a big deal recently, specifically cotton exports, with different countries, different companies choosing to boycott cotton from China, the United States imposing targeted sanctions on cotton manufacturers, and relatedly on officials responsible for what's going on in Xinjiang. We've been talking about that issue. Anyway, those accusations have been made by the United States against China. Now China is making, in their own way, lesser but still significant claims of widespread human rights abuses taking place in the United States. These claims specifically focus on last summer's Black Lives Matter protests, the treatment of protesters, also our handling of the pandemic, including abuses suffered by senior citizens, abuses suffered by the poor, and suffered by homeless citizens of the United States. These are just among many claims being made by China against the United States. And again, the question is turnabout fair play? The United States has made these kinds of accusations in order to justify either widespread sanctions or, at their utmost extremities, humanitarian interventions, quote unquote, in other countries as a sort of casus belli in the modern era. The question I'm going to bring to you, Caleb, I'll enter you in just a second, is this justified? How do you see this move by China? For those listening, we're joined by Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris, our vice president, puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Caleb, back to the topic here, back to the question. What do you make of this new report from China?
Well, they've been doing this for years. When the USA criticizes China's human rights policies, China publishes criticism of U.S. human rights policies. And that report, they have an edition of it that comes out every year. And if you read it, it's really interesting because they take into account things we don't generally take into account here. I mean, they argue that a lack of gun control here in the United States is a violation of human rights because of mass shootings, and the population has the right to be protected from gun violence. They argue things about economic security, that, with the wealth of the United States, the government should be, taking more measures to make sure people have housing and jobs and education. So it's a very interesting document. As far as the situation with the Uyghurs, many people, in China have pointed out that, in the United States, not in the United States, but in Western Europe, there were a number of children who got recruited into ISIS, or their parents were in ISIS. And, when they were returning to Britain and returning to France and returning to Germany, they didn't just release these ISIS kids into the general population. They put them in a de-radicalization program, basically, right? These kids that have grown up in ISIS and grown up in a terrorist group, when they're returning them to their home countries after the terrorist group has been broken up, after they've been broken away from ISIS, they don't just, send them out into the general population to just live their life. They put them, in a center where they're seeing counselors, and they're being basically deprogrammed from ISIS, which is a terrorist cult. And many Chinese, voices have said, why can't China do that in the Uyghur region? They've had terrorist groups. They've had a lot of these terrorist Wahhabi groups that have set up shop, and there have been knife attacks and such. And so why can't they have a de-radicalization program for people that are involved in that? And is that not okay? And that if they have a problem with terrorist groups in their historically Muslim region, shouldn't they have a de-radicalization program? And what about the fact that China is building mosques? That there's all kinds of mosques being constructed, paid for by the Chinese government. Mosques where they preach Islam, but mosques that are anti-terrorism, that don't promote destabilization of China. And why isn't that being discussed? So, these kind of issues, we see things, generally through one perspective. That's not to say China isn't doing anything wrong, per se, in the Uyghur regions, but there are two sides to every story. And this demand that everyone immediately start repeating, the very shrill allegations of some very specific forces, that's just not how the world works. There's generally two sides to every story.
Yeah, this is unfortunate. I mean, even reading Reuters, I mean, activists and UN experts say at least 1 million Muslims have been detained in camps in Xinjiang, the province. They acknowledge that the source is like one person, that this is not coming from a huge number or a large amount of credible information. And on top of that, the number of people who they are talking about, we've killed more Muslims than what they're talking about is in the camps. And I'm not saying that in kind of a justification. I'm just kind of making the point that how do we care about one but not the other? And at which point does the number of people killed from the standpoint of the wars, either in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, if those numbers are higher than what we are talking about in the Chinese population, how are we saying genocide? Also, the population of Uyghurs, the Chinese population in and of itself, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, is going down. The Uyghur population did go down, but it went down less than the Chinese population. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, Caleb. I mean, am I right on that?
Well, sure, and the population, the birth rate decreased because increasingly people are getting access to birth control and abortion, and that women's rights are increasing in that region, right? This is a historically Muslim region where it was kind of a traditional society where women just have babies, right? Well, things have changed. The culture is changing. Women are getting more rights. People are getting more opportunities, and just like here in the United States, people have less children than they did 1 or 2 generations ago. People in the Uyghur regions are having less children. That is true, as is the Chinese population in the region. And so, I mean, again, these hysterical claims, people are screaming at the top of their lungs. One thing I have read that, it's worth criticizing is they do have a rule against beards, right, in the Uyghur regions, that you're not allowed to have a beard of certain length because terrorist groups, that was one thing they were promoting, was having really big, long beards. Well, look, I'm a civil liberties kind of guy. I think that anyone should be able to have whatever beard they want to have, personally. So
that's good.
I would criticize.
I would be considered guilty. I could not answer. My beard is like I don't know, 4 inches long at this point or something. And just to be clear, I'm not a terrorist. Caleb, I'm sorry for cutting in. A little comedic relief or something.
Yeah, but I mean, so obviously, if it was up to me, I would think that was kind of a violation of civil liberties. So that's not to say that everything that goes on there is 100% good and justified, but I mean, there's no interest in balance. And this individual, Adrian Zen, who is the source for a lot of these claims, he is not a credible source. I mean, he is an anti-China fanatic. He's got some rather extreme religious beliefs. And Adrian Zen's this evangelical who is kind of the source of a lot of these allegations about Uyghurs, he is not credible, but yet whatever he says is repeated in the media as if it is undisputedly true. Meanwhile, China's rebuttals and China's side of the story is always treated with just utter suspicion. It couldn't possibly be true. The bias in the coverage of this is very, very extreme.
It is extreme. And here's what makes it worse for me. Allegations of genocide are about the highest level of human rights abuse, a claim that you can make against another country. And in the modern era, in the sort of post-Westphalian period that we're supposed to be living in, what the only excuse, the only true justification in the international moral code we're operating under right now, the only excuse for invading another nation is if they are guilty of rampant, widespread, and ongoing human rights abuses. That's, humanitarian interventionism, as it's called, is widely seen in the Western military and broadly taken up by the Western press as being justified, depending on how bad the crime is. And yet, so if we're making the claim that China is guilty of committing genocide, that seems to be setting us up with a casus belli to declare war at some point. Am I wrong on that? And I guess one further spin on this, China, even though they are making not nearly the same level of allegation against the United States, like you said in the report, they bring up many myriad different crimes the United States is guilty of, both moral and potentially illegal crimes. For instance, just interestingly enough, they brought up the sanctions against the International Criminal Court for investigating what the United States did and has done and is doing in Afghanistan. That is not something we should have done. We should not have sanctioned ICC officials just for addressing our crimes. Anyway, back to the specific topic. we could use this to justify an invasion of China. Would you see China ever doing something similar with the United States or another country on human rights abuses? Or do you think that is not in their modus operandi? Caleb.
Well, look, China has one overseas military base in Djibouti. Russia has 8 overseas military bases. The United States has well over 800. So, the regime change is clearly coming from the United States. China is not sending its military into other countries. I think the last foreign intervention that China engaged in was in 1978, the Kampuchea War, where they fought with Vietnam, and were trying to protect, Cambodia and were attacking Vietnam and invading Vietnam. That was in 1978. That was a long time ago. I don't see China, accusing the United States of human rights violations and invading the United States anytime soon. Red Dawn is a great fictional Hollywood movie with Patrick Swayze, but it's fiction. It's not real.
Well, I think what Shane is getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, is I think geopolitics from a Chinese perspective in the next 10 years. Like, let's say by the end of the century, China is the dominant economy. I think what's taken place is that the United States and Western countries have freaked out. They looked and said, oh my God, these guys are going to build a satellite around the moon. These guys are in cooperation with Russia. They have a cooperation with Iran. They have the Belt and Road Initiative, meaning they've been instigating themselves in other countries with diplomacy. You heard Psaki saying the issue with the Chinese vaccine is that they were giving it away, and they call that quote unquote vaccine diplomacy, as opposed to, giving people vaccines to ensure that they don't die of asphyxiation in hospital beds. And so I think they look at that and they say, we have to stop this now before this goes too far. And hence the sanctions. You have Joe Biden screaming about genocide, and you have what seems to be a certain level of hysteria. I mean, I frame this for us. We have about 2 minutes left. In geopolitical terms, Xinjiang province and the Uyghurs in this situation, what are they being used as from the standpoint of the United States? Why this specific population? It seems like they're using this as a cudgel in a similar way as the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But what's your take on this?
Well, it actually goes back to that because China, teamed up with the United States and Afghanistan in the 1980s to fight the Soviet Union. And during that war, they allowed, the Wahhabis and the extremist, terrorist forces aligned with Osama bin Laden to set up in the Uyghur regions and then go over the border to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And the Saudis, they set up all kinds of schools to train people in, very extreme, fanatical, Islamic, Wahhabi ideology. And those forces never left. And really, this is, a lot of Chinese folks say this is kind of a mistake, that it was a mistake for China to align with the United States and Afghanistan, to align with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. It was a mistake to let the terrorists, set up training schools and such. And that now this is kind of, this is blowback, that those forces set up shop in that region. And as a result, they're causing China a lot of problems, a lot of terrorist attacks, a lot of knife attacks, a lot of, strife, between the ethnically Chinese population and the Uyghur population. And that this is this problem that they're having there now, with the strife, with the instability, with some of these radical Islamic teachers that are inciting people to violence, the need to kind of deprogram people from the brainwashing of ISIS-like terrorist groups. This is kind of blowback, and that China kind of regrets that decision to be on the wrong side in Afghanistan, and that also you have to remember Afghanistan, since the U.S. invasion, Afghanistan has been a center of instability. Look, there's not just terrorist groups in Afghanistan. There's opium opium poppy fields and heroin gangs, and that ever since the destabilization of Afghanistan, the 20 years the USA has been in Afghanistan, there's been chaos. And Afghanistan, that chaos, the drug dealers, the terrorist groups that have set up shop there, they go over the border. They cause problems for China. They cause problems for Iran. They cause problems for Russia. And that instability in Afghanistan has gone over the border into China.
Very interesting. Caleb, you are a wealth of information, man. I've heard somebody make the comment that they could listen to Caleb for 2 hours and you're just talking off the top of your head. So, thank you for coming on. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and geopolitical stage. And you can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We have followed Julian Assange from the beginning. My channel, even before I started working on Radio Sputnik, but also now, I found it to be an extremely important case. I found the information that he put out has been extremely important. And there's something hypocritical about news organizations being able to use his content while not necessarily facing the repercussions of those actions, of using that content in the same way that he has. Not to mention the issue of press freedom is in your face in the way that the U.S. has been going after him. Well, Julian Assange is still sitting in a prison in Belmarsh in the UK, where the judge has basically refused to extradite him. However, he's still up for an appeal. In order to have a conversation about Assange and the latest on his case, we're joined by Misty Winston, political activist, organizer, and co-host both on Facts on the Ground podcast and hashtag Free Assange Visuals. Misty, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So tell us, what is the latest on Assange? I mean, did I say everything correctly? I always like to confirm with the guests. But on top of that, what is the latest?
That's all very accurate. Well done.
Excellent. Well, I always like to check. I mean, it could be something, it's the person who's coming on is usually the subject matter expert. And even though it's like we cover these stories, we want to make sure that we're up to date on the information and that what we're saying is accurate, as a basis of conversation. What's the latest so far?
The Assange case is very complicated, so it's definitely difficult to keep things straight.
Well, it is uber weird.
Now, what's coming up?
Well, it's uber weird to me because the judge agreed with America. By the same token, said he was autistic and he would off himself, and so there's no way she can send him to an American jail. Very strange ruling. And I kept thinking I kept asking,
It's a very weird ruling. It is, Jamarl, it's incredibly weird. And the fact that not only did she say that he is in a precarious state on a mental health level, she then also denied him bail, which then keeps him in the conditions that caused him to become in a precarious mental health condition, which is really kind of bizarre. But today is the deadline for the cross appeal. So his legal team is going to be potentially launching a cross appeal against. What a cross appeal means is, like you said, she basically agreed with the United States on every single other point other than the fact that he is in a very bad mental state, and if he were to be extradited to the United States, he is a suicide risk. So the cross appeal would basically challenge all of the other points, which all of the other points are all of the things that would have an impact on press freedom. And so it's a very tricky situation for his legal team because if they do go with the cross appeal, that then opens him up to the fact that she agreed with them on the mental health aspect. That could then be put into question again. So it's a very tricky situation for his legal team to deal with right now. But that deadline for that is today. I've been checking all morning since I woke up. I haven't seen anything yet as to whether or not they have filed that. But that is supposed to be for today. So we will hopefully know within a few hours what their intentions are with that.
And what is the next step once this appeal is filed? What's the next deadline? What are the next couple of landmarks on the road to some either, this being successfully appealed by the United States government and Assange being extradited, or him being cleared of those charges and being permitted to go free? Basically, what are the next steps on that road, Misty?
Well, that is a little bit murky. We don't necessarily have dates for those kinds of things. Those are very tentative. There's some rumors that in May, if the appeal is denied or if the case continues, that there will be more court dates in May. We don't necessarily have specifics on that yet. I think that we won't really know that until the cross appeal is in fact filed. But there are a lot of really important dates coming up just in general in terms of his case. For example, April 5th is the 11th anniversary of the collateral murder video being released. For people who are not familiar, the collateral murder video was part of the Chelsea Manning leaks that showed the Apache helicopter literally committing war crimes in front of your face. The double tap, they shot journalists. There were children in the van that they were shooting at. It's a horrifying video to watch. Anybody who hasn't seen it should go and watch. So that's April 5th. And then also April 11th will be 2 years since Julian was essentially kidnapped from the Ecuadorian embassy and trafficked to Belmarsh, the prison that you mentioned earlier, which is often called the Gitmo of the UK. So April 5th and April 11th are two very big dates coming up just in general in terms of his situation. As far as court dates go, that we don't really have necessarily like hard dates on yet. And we probably won't until the cross appeal is either filed or not filed. So hopefully we can just convince the United States government to drop this and, move on from there. But, we'll see.
I mean, honestly, it's been how many years? 7 years? They've chased this man for all of this time. And I think for them, from the standpoint of dropping it, they don't have to do anything and expend any energy to keep it going, if that makes sense. Right. Like, there's no cost in them keeping it going. It's just somebody pressuring somebody in the UK to keep this case going. And so it's like, it's this kind of weird dynamic where one side can basically prosecute, go after, vilify, and the other side has to do everything in their power just to keep him from out of being in prison. It's also this weird aspect where they're extending the laws to go after Assange, but not extending the protections to Julian Assange. Very strange, very weird. So.
Well, and it should terrify everybody because essentially the United States government is claiming jurisdiction over the entire globe. And they are saying that if you publish something that they disapprove of or that embarrasses them or that they don't like, they will come and get you. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you live, where you're from, what country you are a citizen of. Julian Assange isn't a United States citizen. He's an Australian citizen who also had Ecuadorian citizenship before it was revoked right before the Ecuadorian government decided to essentially sell him to the UK. And so, it is weird. They want to prosecute him under our laws, but they're affording him none of the protections of our Constitution, which would include the First Amendment. So to me, that's terrifying. And that's the big part of this that people seem to be missing. There's a lot of this that's made out to be about, Julian's personality or this caricature that they've made of him. And it really is so much bigger than that.
Yeah, far much bigger than that. I mean, press freedom in general. I mean, you're going after a guy for publishing factually true information. That by itself. Like that by itself.
Well, that's another thing that people need to recognize. WikiLeaks has never had to retract a single word of a single document that they have ever published. They have a 100% record of accuracy. I challenge anybody to find another news organization with that kind of record. It doesn't exist. WikiLeaks is the only one. And they've also, had broken some of the biggest stories of the past decade. I mean, they've revealed literal war crimes and, corporate corruption and criminality and, the crimes of governments across the globe. They don't just leak on the United States government. They leak on every major government across the world. So what they do is invaluable. They revolutionize journalism. journalism and transparency. And I mean, obviously, that's the reason why, these powerful governments are so keen on taking him down. That's all the more reason why the people should be standing up and fighting for him.
1,000%. 1,000%. Yes. What has happened to WikiLeaks up to this point? So that's the other question. Meaning, is WikiLeaks larger than Julian Assange? And were they able to exist and still do what they do now with Assange being either in the embassy or, for that matter, imprisoned? Or have they been crippled by this entire
They
escapade?
have been, just in my opinion, they obviously have been crippled to a certain degree. They are still functional, they are still operational, but they have to spend a lot of their time, money, resources, and effort defending Julian's life. And that's, totally understandable. They should be doing that 100%. But there's no question that they have been impacted by this and by this witch hunt, and they will continue to be. And that's 100% part of the reason why they have made such a concerted effort to go after Julian Assange. That they wanted to take down WikiLeaks. They wanted to cripple WikiLeaks. They not only do they want to cripple WikiLeaks, they want to cause a chilling effect that will prevent other people from becoming a Julian Assange or from organizing a publication like WikiLeaks. So, it's my opinion that we need thousands of WikiLeaks across the globe doing exactly what Julian Assange was doing and working to force transparency onto powerful people. That was the point of WikiLeaks.
That would certainly be good. But again, it seems like a lot of people have successfully been cowed by this, and the assumption is that this has a chilling effect going forward on the media in general, like we've been talking about, like you made astutely, the observation you made astutely just a couple of minutes ago. What more would we need to see for Assange to find freedom? What more would you need to see? Here's the thing: weekly vigils for years now on behalf of Assange. Many prominent civil rights groups coming out and saying that the pursuit of his extradition is unjust and unlawful. Many esteemed public intellectuals in the United States and abroad making the same arguments. We've seen this recently following the decision to deny his appeal, although of course that is to deny his extradition, although of course that is being appealed. We've seen this recently, this coming out. What more would we need to see for that to actually work? Misty?
Well, I have been saying for a very long time that this affecting any change in this case is going to take a public movement. And you're right, there have been especially over the past few months, there have been a lot of civil rights organizations and public intellectuals and world leaders from across the globe or former world leaders have all banded together and signed letters and all of these things, and that's all great, and that's all been building over the past several months, but it really is going to take mass public pressure. We really need people to start making noise about this, talking about it, calling your representatives, writing letters, getting in the streets. Going forming direct actions, going to your local state capitol and holding a protest or a march or whatever in defense.
That's either going to take. We're out of town. That's either going to take mass internet awareness or mass media awareness. And frankly, I'm sad to say I don't see the second happening anytime soon. We're out of time. We were joined by Misty Winston, political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast and Free Assange Vigils. Follow her on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back with headlines in the last hour of today's show.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, events, and more across our divided country and the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody's morning is going well and continues to go well. To give a brief roundup of today's show, at 7:30, we spoke with Aurora Akanksha. She's the new candidate for the Secretary General of the United Nations. If selected, she'd be the youngest ever and the first female Secretary General of the UN. We talked with her about the problems she sees at the UN, how she hopes to fix them, and the nature of the UN as a whole. At 8:15, we spoke with Caleb Maupin for half an hour. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. We talked about the United States funneling millions of dollars into groups the U.S. is fighting in Iraq and other countries, as well as China turning the tables on the United States with a report documenting widespread human rights abuses in the U.S. over 2020. We just finished up a conversation with Misty Winston, political activist, organizer, and co-host of Facts on the Ground podcast and Free Assange Visuals. Talked with her about Assange's extradition appeal, his state, what it would take to free him, and what's coming next in the pursuit of his freedom from extradition as the United States pushes for him to be extradited to the U.S. Next, at 9:15, we're going to be talking with Nico House about AOC on lefty critics from the left, and if and how Democrats could reform themselves. Also, Nico being suspended from Twitter. We're going to get into that. And then at 9:30, we're talking with KJ No about the latest in Myanmar, as Saturday saw the deadliest day, the bloodiest day yet, with 114 citizens killed and airstrikes on Karen territory, forcing upwards of 3,000 Myanmari citizens, Karen ethnic minority folks, to flee across the border into Thailand. That's the today's show. Without further ado, let's get into headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 487 new coronavirus deaths and 55,552 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 63,199 cases per day. That's an increase of 15% from the average 2 weeks earlier. The numbers are going back up after dropping for weeks in a row. As of this morning, more than 30,285,400 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and about 548,867 people have died from it here in the U.S. so far. The Pentagon's top health officials have said that all U.S. service personnel and other Defense Department beneficiaries will be eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine starting May 1st. They've predicted that the entire Defense Department staff will be vaccinated by mid-July. In the European Union, the Medicines Agency for the EU has approved 3 new vaccine manufacturing facilities. The facilities in Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland will produce the Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna vaccines, respectively. Also, in related big news, also coming from the Medicines Agency, the agency has reported that it will widen the permitted storage conditions for the Pfizer vaccine, which had previously needed to be stored in conditions of -70 Celsius, that's -95 degrees Fahrenheit. The new conditions for storage and transport range from -25 to -15 Celsius, or from -13 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So in other words, they have basically made it much easier to store and transport the Pfizer vaccine. After German Chancellor Angela Merkel canceled the country's planned lockdown over Easter, Germany's health minister Lothar Wieler has now warned that if German residents don't socially distance over the holiday, the country could see its third and worst wave yet. Wieler has said there could be as many as 100,000 infections per day if the spread of the virus isn't slowed. As of late last week, the 7-day average of new cases in Germany was just over 15,000 per day, more than double the number reported over a month earlier. The Mexican government has published revised figures showing its COVID death tolls are 60% higher than previously reported. That puts them in excess of 300,000 deaths, and it leaves them with the second highest death toll in the world behind the United States, nearby Brazil, which stands at about 312,000 deaths from COVID so far. Total excess deaths in Mexico from all causes stood at 417,000 by the end of the 6th week of this year, when the recently updated COVID death statistics showed 294,287 deaths from the virus. And again, since then, deaths have gone up. In national political news, both Republican and Democrat politicians have visited the border last week and over the weekend as scrutiny of the migrant holding facilities has increased over recent weeks. A group of Republican senators led by Ted Cruz visited the border, with Cruz sharing a video of himself standing near the banks of the Rio Grande, warning about a flood of cartel-managed human smuggling. Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, meanwhile, led a delegation of 6 Democrat representatives, including Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, to visit Carrizo Springs, which is the site of a Department of Health and Human Services holding facility for up to 1,000 children aged 13 to 17 who cross the border without a parent or guardian. The topic of the growing migrant crisis took center stage during President Biden's first press conference as president last Thursday. In New York's Attorney General Letitia James has subpoenaed dozens of officials from the administration of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. These subpoenas pertain to an investigation into sexual and workplace harassment allegations, which have been leveled against the governor over recent weeks in increasing numbers. News of these subpoenas follows reports which surfaced last week alleging that Cuomo had directed the state health department to expedite testing for members of his family. Cuomo, who was last year elevated as a paragon of leadership in his handling of the coronavirus in his state, has come under fire for months since Attorney General James released a report earlier this year alleging that his administration had undercounted COVID death tolls for residents of nursing homes by upwards of 50%, closer to 60%, if I'm remembering the number correctly. And again, it wasn't just alleged by Letitia James, it was later confirmed by the state itself when they updated their numbers. Basically, Cuomo's administration had been sending people with COVID who'd lived in nursing homes to hospitals and then had put them back in nursing homes when they hadn't, when they wouldn't necessarily be completely clear of the disease, not too long after they had, initially recovered from it in the hospitals. The problem with doing that, of course, is you're putting the fox right back in the henhouse. You're putting the virus back in the conditions where it is both most likely to spread and most likely to be dangerous to that segment of the population that would most suffer its worst effects. And then, just to fill people in case you've had your head like an ostrich buried in some warm sand somewhere, his administration and aide, also in a private meeting with Democratic lawmakers, basically said they froze. His administration froze under the fear of scrutiny by the United States Department of Justice under Donald Trump when it came to how they counted these deaths and how they handled the situation. And it's not a good situation. That is the first and the worst crisis that Cuomo had to face, although it's been papered over somewhat by the more recent allegations of sexual harassment and workplace brute force politics. Jamarl, earlier in your monologue, you were talking about how you got this story right. The Intercept later covered the UFO story with basically this new person in a position of authority being stonewalled as they sought requests. Here's where I'm going with this. You had that story right a month and a half ago. We had this story right for months now. We've been covering this consistently, and Cuomo has come under increasing pressure over time. He said he's not going to resign, but there are impeachment movements in motion right now to get him impeached, and it seems like this stuff is only growing for him. We got this one right. We've had this one right. I'm not going to give us a slow clap or anything like that because that's kind of awkward, but a couple stories we've been right on ahead of most of the rest of the press. What's your take?
If you won't do it, I'll do it, Shane. I'll do it. I mean, we hit this months ago, right? And the media, CNN was trying to act as if it was trying to cover this up and everybody else. No, we hit this early on. So yeah, and we were right on it. I don't know how Cuomo stays in the office. I mean, the pressure that he is under at this point is phenomenal. Yeah, I mean, from the standpoint of the deaths, and I got to be honest, the people haven't necessarily even been paying too much attention to the deaths. It's been more the salacious stuff. But the investigations, trust me, will focus on that. In addition to, because they're thinking, did he get something out of the fact that he was undercounting the deaths? Would he have gotten a book deal if he was undercounting the deaths? And so was there this kind of fiduciary incentive to behave that way? Prosecutors can look at that stuff any kind of way they want, especially if that looks bad. That looks bad. And by the way, while you are denying the ability for people in those resident homes to know whether or not they have COVID, which was leading to the deaths, he ensured that his family got tested. Oh, that burns. That burns, man.
It does. Yeah, mismanagement across the state and then nepotism at the highest levels. And, the line is, if it bleeds, it leads. But apparently, if it quietly suffocates, if it undergoes silent asphyxiation, it's not worth covering nearly as much as.
That shouldn't be funny, but that really is.
Arguably less significant. It's true. It's true. And it's not good. It's a flaw with our media and maybe a flaw with the human mind. But we got to get back into the headlines here. The state's attorney for Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, has put a permanent halt on the prosecutions of offenses ranging from drug possession and prostitution to trespassing, traffic offenses, and other misdemeanors. This comes after Mosby announced a temporary halt on prosecutions of these offenses last March, a move which saw an overall drop in violent crimes of about 20%, with property crimes decreasing by 36% and the total number of homicides dropping by 13% compared to the previous year. One side note on my hand, specifically with the homicides, if you got lockdowns in place, I could see that alone lowering the death toll. So I'm worried that there's a little bit of, mixing in correlation with causation here. But hey, this is going to be something they're going to check out going forward because, again, she just made this move permanent. Mosby has said that, quote, a year ago, we underwent an experiment in Baltimore, end quote, and that what the city had, quote, learned in that year, and it's so incredibly exciting, is that there's no public safety value in prosecuting these low-level offenses. The era of tough-on-crime prosecutors is over in Baltimore, end quote. And again, that is the state's attorney for Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby. On Saturday, lawmakers in New York State reached an agreement on legislation which would legalize cannabis, provide for sales of marijuana products to individuals aged 21 and over, and set up a licensing process for the delivery of marijuana. Individual New Yorkers could grow up to 3 mature and 3 immature plants for personal consumption. Local governments would be able to opt out of retail sales of marijuana products. The state, meanwhile, would impose a 9% tax on the sale of cannabis, with another 4% to be shared between local and county governments. Passage of this legislation would make New York the latest in upwards of a dozen other states which allow for the legal sale and possession of marijuana. And if this bill is passed and then signed, it would go into effect immediately. So you could see changes soon on this. In Minneapolis, a jury is expected to hear the opening arguments in the case of Derek Chauvin, the man who's facing charges of killing George Floyd by using a knee as a restraint on Floyd's neck. Chauvin has denied charges of manslaughter and 2 counts of murder. Floyd's death last year sparked last summer's Black Lives Matter protests. In international news, the container ship blocking the Suez Canal is now almost free after a team of tugboats has successfully unmoored it from its position straddling the canal. The ship, named the Ever Given, has cost nearly $60 billion in trade so far. This Saturday was the bloodiest day yet in Myanmar, with over 114 killed by the coup government as protesters again took to the streets on a military holiday in the country. The military launched airstrikes in the territory of the Karen ethnic minority on the same day, striking a village near the Thai border, across which upwards of 3,000 Karen refugees are said to have fled. And now the Thai prime minister has said his country is preparing for large numbers of refugees from Myanmar. Dozens were killed and dozens of people are still unaccounted for following an attack by hundreds of Islamist militants on the town of Palma in Mozambique. During the attack, hundreds of people were besieged in a hotel. A convoy of about 17 vehicles left the hotel as part of an evacuation, but that convoy was attacked, and nearly half of the vehicles are still reported missing. The town is near the site of a natural gas project owned by a French company. The North Korean government on Friday announced that it had developed and launched 2 newly developed tactical guided missiles, saying the launch was very successful, I'm quoting here, very successful, just as it had been confidently predicted, end quote. This follows an announcement by the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff last Thursday that North Korea had launched 2 unidentified projectiles into the Sea of Japan. On Saturday, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Istanbul to criticize the decision by Turkey's government to withdraw from an international treaty on violence against women last Wednesday. The Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, better known as the Istanbul Convention, is a human rights treaty signed in 2011 aimed at preventing violence against women, providing protections for victims, and diminishing impunity for those responsible for acts of violence. Turkey's presidency argued the treaty had been, quote, hijacked by a group of people attempting to normalize homosexuality, end quote, which it said was incompatible with the country's social and family values, quote unquote. These protests followed the death of a 17-year-old pregnant girl earlier this week who was stabbed to death by her husband in the Aegean province of Izmir. On Friday, Taiwan announced that 20 Chinese military aircraft had entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone. There was no immediate comment from Beijing, which has defended past such exercises. And the Chinese government has supported a boycott of clothing retailer H&M's products after the company announced it wouldn't buy cotton produced in the Xinjiang region of China, with a Chinese government spokesperson saying the clothing company, quote, won't earn a penny, end quote, in the country due to its decision. Wow. And in Belarus, police have arrested more than 100 protesters in the capital, Minsk, who had assembled for a protest and march to call for the resignation of the president, Alexander Lukashenko. Protests against the president were dormant over this past winter following widespread events late last year against Lukashenko following his victory in 2020's presidential election, a victory which is widely believed to have been fraudulent. And in our last headline, briefly, Facebook on Saturday froze the page of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, allegedly for sharing unsupported claims in favor of the efficacy of Carbatovir, a time-based medicine in treating COVID-19. And that is time, not T-I-M-E, but T-H-Y-M-E, like the tasty herb. Anyway, Maduro has been suspended from the platform for 30 days. His page will still be visible, but he will be unable to post to it. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a minute on on the other side of this break.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. $15 an hour. I have complained about this breathlessly and unceasingly. I am a bitter ender on that front. Bitter ender, the bitterest of enders on this notion of $15 an hour. Joe Biden said, heroes. They can't go on a starvation wage. They are heroes. They gave their lives for us. They were out there during COVID-19 when we were stuck in our homes, when we were terrified, holding our kids, terrified that COVID could get them. They were out there. They couldn't afford to stay in their homes. They couldn't afford to not work in those factories or to not man those stores at 7-Eleven or in the grocery stores. And yet, Joe Biden said, we can't allow those people to continue to operate with a starvation wage, especially when they were there for us. And now that those heroes are not, 5,000 people are not dying a day, they seem to be less heroes. And instead of Joe Biden fighting vigorously in the way that he said, when he said they deserve a $15 an hour minimum wage, he said it as a candidate pushing back against Trump. He said it as a president. Once he won that office, he told the public, put me in that office. Give me the Congress that I need, and I will fight for America's agenda. And Joe Biden immediately starts downing the $15 an hour, telling governors, I don't think I can do it. The House of Representatives put it in the bill for budget reconciliation. Joe Biden, who had the power to push Joe Manchin to get on board and those Democrats to get on board. Joe Biden, who had the power to push Kamala Harris to get rid of the parliamentarians so he can affect his particular agenda in regards to pushing it through. Joe Biden, who could have gotten rid of the filibuster to, again, affect his agenda. He, in no circumstance, even though he had the power to push, he had the bully pulpit to push on the outside if he needed to, and he had the gravitas of the office to try to get Joe Manchin on board. And yet, he didn't do it. He took every opportunity to not do it. And despite the fact that the President of the United States says, I am for $15 an hour, we got to pay these heroes. And despite the House putting it in the bill, when Joe Manchin refused, there was no pushback. And Ilhan Omar explains it. Let's play this clip real quick. And better yet, let's bring in our guest. We are joined by Nico House to have a conversation about this because I'm greatly annoyed by this, and I think Nico might be annoyed by this too. So this is a great opportunity. Oh, okay. Well, we'll get him back. So let's do this. Let's play the clip first, and hopefully he'll come back and we'll be able to have a conversation with him about it. Let's play the clip.
Just to shift to the big picture, it was reported by Politico that you were part of a Congressional Progressive Caucus delegation that recently met with White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain. What asks did you make, and what do you say to your critics on the left who say progressives in Congress like yourself, the Squad, the CPC, haven't pushed Biden hard enough on issues like the $15 minimum wage, universal health care, the filibuster?
I mean, it is because that we have been pushing really that the American Rescue Plan is deemed to be the most progressive policy in decades. We understand that there was a failed strategy, not by the progressives in Congress, because we put $15 in the package, by the administration. I think their early signaling that could be negotiated out, and it might not stick as part of the final package, really, I think, endangered the ability for us to pass $15. And so when we were in that meeting, we pushed for a strategy to get $15 minimum wage. We pushed for a strategy to pass the agenda that the administration ran on, that the Democrats agree on, whether it is passing sensible gun laws, dealing with our immigration crisis, and all of the things that we all care about. What we walked away from that conversation with is an understanding that there is a limited window of opportunity for us to push these pieces of legislation. There are members in the Senate within the Democratic Party that are certainly not there yet on the priority pieces of legislation that we have. And it's going to be up to the administration to come up with a strategy to push them, because progressives in the House are constantly told to get in line and to push policies that are going to have an impact on people's lives. That's what those Democrats in the Senate need to be told, and that's what's going to take.
All right. So basically, the president wasn't on board. The Senate wasn't on board. So we just kind of went with it, and we need the president to push, as if they have no agency. Joining us to have a conversation is Nico House. He's a political activist, broadcast journalist, and founder of the CEO of the MCSC network. Nico, that clip aggravated me like nobody's business, because basically it doesn't really matter if Joe Biden was really for the $15 an hour. He said he was for it, and you could have used that to wring his neck or take a pound of flesh out of him if he was going to try to deviate from it. What are your thoughts on this?
He said he was for it. Supposedly the Democrats ran on passing a living wage. My thoughts on this, I'm just as furious, because I don't know if you noticed, but all of a sudden it became this administration and some Democrats in the House. Before it was Trump's administration and Mitch McConnell. Nobody wants to bring up the fact that everybody keeps trying to point at Joe Manchin like Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer. Like Chuck Schumer isn't the leader in the Senate. Like Biden can't send someone to the Senate right now to squash any opposition to a $15 minimum wage bill or any minimum wage bill. We hear a bunch of excuses about how that, the procedural necessity to take $15 minimum wage out of the big bill that just passed, which is once again just another corporate bailout. But we didn't hear that excuse when they were using, the quote unquote stimulus checks to threaten Trump to shut the government down with the recent appropriations bill that passed in December, because they just took the stimulus and they just attached it to a big budget, which of course, if Trump would have vetoed, would have shut the government down at least temporarily. So we're just hearing a bunch of excuses and a lot of hypocrisy, and I think that people are really starting to catch on because they're tired of hearing the excuses also.
Well, and here's the weird thing to me. Looking at, you brought up Trump, for instance. Trump seemed more progressive than the Democrats when it came to stimulus checks. And that's kind of saying something. When he was pushing for $2,000 late last year, he got pushback, yes, from Republicans, but also from Democrats. And admittedly, he'd been trying to get them for months at that point. to diminish the stimulus bill they were planning. But when it comes to actual checks, specific checks, he was in favor of more than they pushed for. And now that Biden has pushed out the $1,400 checks, he's adding Trump 600 into it to make the grand total of 2,000. And weirdly enough, even though Biden constantly references Trump as a boogeyman to justify his own presidency, he's not giving Trump any credit for making his end of that. Where do you see, again, progressives not pushing Democrats in the Senate or the House in ways that they could be? But where do you see them going with this? It seemed like the Republicans, this is a separate conversation, could possibly win away some of the progressive vote if they were to pursue more economically progressive policies than the Democrats. And it seems like with Trump stronger than ever going into 2024, or at least strong enough to take the lead in 2024 as the presidential candidate right now, it seems like the Republicans might push in that direction if they want to go along with Trump. How would progressives, how would Democrats in general deal with that, Nico?
I don't know how the progressives in the Senate, or excuse me, in the House would deal with it. I can tell people. I know there's like this weird, oh well, Biden, got us our quote unquote stimmies. Well, Trump did give us what, 1,200 in one check, and then with the split Congress, gridlock Congress was able to get that out, and then the 600. But then you also have the additional unemployment plus the 600 a week on top of that, once again done in the gridlock Congress, plus him taking his own executive authority to extend the unemployment for a few more weeks and extend the moratorium. Under the Biden administration, we never got a moratorium. We didn't get an additional 600. They reduced that, and then they gave us $600 and are expecting you all to be. Excuse me, they gave us what? They gave us 600, and then what? Another 1,200 eventually, but that's not more than what Trump has given us. And like this, that's just being frank. And people are doing the math, and they're remembering what it'll look like in the next couple of years when they have to run in the midterms.
Nico, I think the most disturbing part of the comment, though, has to do with the way she doesn't understand. It's almost as if they acquiesce in politics. Like their job, they want something. Great. What do they want? They want health care, they want education, etc. All right. And in doing that, it's like, all right, what powers do you have at your disposal? You know the Democrats are against you. You know they're not for it. You know the president is ultimately not for it. But the president said he is for it. Why can't you use the optics of that? Meaning they had the power to crash the bill and point and say, look, we are going to push for $15 an hour. The public said it and the president said it. They didn't do it. And when you listen to AOC, who's like, Biden is transforming and the Democrats are transforming themselves, and adds in a dollop of identity politics saying, people are not for it and they need to understand that it's an issue of privilege. She's sounding horrendous on this stuff. I mean, these guys are transforming into the Democrats before our eyes.
Yeah, I mean, AOC honestly just sounds like a duplicitous liar. I don't know how to call her at this point. The fact that she gaslit people by claiming that this is a party for the migrant, immigrant people that have been helped, and you're throwing black and brown people under the bus. It's like we were hearing about these private prisons coming out and suing because they're not having their prisons filled, and so now states are, increasing the quotas, and we also see that these migrant families are being separated still at the border, and now the kids are not only in cages, but they're over capacity, and not only in the ones made for kids, but also for the ones made for adults as well. And so AOC doesn't care. She just basically is telling us, I don't care. I'm still getting paid. The Democrats are signaling to us the same way. We're going to show our hypocrisy because we think y'all are stupid enough to fall for it because they're insulated in their own little echo chambers on social media. Even though AOC does avoid Twitter now, she's not been as active on Twitter because Twitter has figured out her game. She likes to take Instagram Live and Facebook at this point, but people are beginning to see through. And so what you're seeing AOC do is, in my opinion, just say screw it. If they already see through me, I might as well just go ahead and go full Democrat. I think that's what we saw.
Yeah, I'll put it this way: they back certain lefty policies, and on some level, if you got the stuff over the finish line, they back it. But some of the stuff she's saying here is unfortunate, to put it mildly. And at this point, you're right. Liberals have been like, let's just not talk about the border. Why do they keep talking about the border? Why do they keep saying something but the water? It's very weird on Twitter when you see this stuff. The voice that you guys were listening to is Nico House, a political activist, broadcast journalist, and founder and CEO of MCSC Network. You can follow Nico on Twitter at NicoCSFB. Follow Mikasa Sukasa Network on Twitter at MCSC Network, and watch videos on YouTube by searching for MCSC Network with Nico House. Nico, one more question, 30 seconds. You were kicked off of Twitter, if I'm understanding it correctly. Can you tell us what happened on that?
No, I wasn't kicked off to Twitter. I had to take care of some family matters, so I disabled it for a few days.
I see. Okay, fair enough. We're just making sure we don't like what people we deal with get censored. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with the topic of Myanmar in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Yesterday was called a day of shame in Myanmar as protesters were gunned down by the hundreds. The military had armed protesters basically not to come out and protest on what they call a national holiday, the Armed Forces Day, honoring the Tatmadaw, as the military is called. They warned people they could be shot in the back, they could be shot in the head, and they kept that promise. We're over 300 people that have been killed in total by the military, and the protesters, to their credit, does not seem to be stopping or submitting to military rule. To have this conversation or to have a discussion on this, we're joined with KJ No. He's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon, is available now at iacenter.org. KJ, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Did I explain the opening for that? I tried to give just a basic summary of what's taking place to give us an intro spot.
I mean, the long and short of it is that the bloodshed is increasing, and it's what we predicted right from our first, interviews weeks ago, that this would result in massive bloodshed. Yesterday, there were 114 people shot dead by the military. 40 of them were in Mandalay alone, and another 27 were in Yangon. But it's widespread all over all of the regions. And at the same time, there's continued resistance and continued, creative forms of both nonviolent resistance that are cresting over into calls for a kind of armed revolution against the Tatmadaw.
KJ, they almost have to, don't they? I mean, it seems that peaceful resistance works in a context where a government has somewhat of a limit on the amount of pain and injury they're willing to dispense. But what happens when the government, or the military in this case, basically says there is no limit to this, and we will massacre, we will shoot, we will do whatever? I mean, they were shooting kids, they were shooting babies. So on some level, if the military is willing to go to this lengths, how does peaceful resistance in this case work? Or am I wrong on this? Am I being too harsh in regards to the tactics that are necessary to push back against what is basically a military coup?
Well, you're right in that the military doesn't have limits as far as its use of firepower is concerned. And we have to remind our listeners again that, the military has been leveling this kind of violence, this level of violence, this mass slaughter, on the ethnic communities, for decades. This is for them. This is just an ordinary day. This is a routine day at work, and they can escalate even further. But regarding the viability of armed resistance, there are several factors involved there. And if we just tease them out a little bit, remember there are multiple armed ethnic organizations. Some of these are veritable armies, and they fall along ethnic lines largely. There's the Kachin state, Shan state, Kokang. There is the Wa, the Kaya state, the Kayin state. And all of these have different armies with different levels of firepower, different levels of alliances with each other, and different levels of animosity or cooperation with the Tatmadaw. The key organization that we're looking, or we have to watch right now, is in Kachin state. The Kachin Independence Army is literally taking up arms and accompanying the protesters. And also, we also see this with the Karen State Army, the Karen National Liberation Army, also, is visibly and demonstratively, showing force of arms. More recently, if I'm not mistaken, they have actually, the Kachin have actually attacked military bases, and there you see images where the Tatmadaw have been, have been disarmed and are, kind of held in a prisoner of war state. So this could get, much, much more bloody, much, much more dangerous than it already is, as if it weren't dangerous enough. And then the other compounding factor is, as I pointed out, is some of the ethnic armies are more inclined to ally with the Tatmadaw simply because of the violations and abuses and the betrayals of the NLD. They do not consider the NLD to be a reliable partner in any sense.
And I want to come back. I want to get into the sort of cause of why we're seeing this much activity in the protests to begin with. But I want to come back when we have a little bit more time to talk about the different ethnic minority groups, the different militias that are forming, and the prospect that you could see a fragmentation of Myanmar, which would go against the wishes, of course, of the military coup government, but also of the former leadership of the country, the in captivity leadership currently would go against their wishes as well. If you saw a breakup of the country, none of the parties that are currently in power or were formerly in power would be in favor of that. But I would be curious to see if that would, if you think that's a reasonable result of different ethnic minority groups deciding to get involved. But I want to come, first of all, to the protests. Why are we seeing such activity by the protesters here? Is this just about the idea that they have put Aung San Suu Kyi, they put the previous government, they've detained them indefinitely? Or is there what are the deeper issues that you think would cause so many people to come out into the streets on such a regular and active basis, despite the risk of bloodshed and death? KJ.
I think it's a couple of things. I mean, the initial protests were clearly about the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, but you can also see that it has spread out. You're no longer seeing the uniquely urban and Western influence protests with their English language signs and their perfectly, produced banners and clearly there's some coordination going on. But now you're seeing, massive protests in the ethnic communities, in the countryside, in the hills. So it's spreading. Part of it has to do with the heavy hand, the bloodshed, the visible violence and in-your-face, bloodshed that is happening. The military, I think, is somewhat at a loss. It did not expect this level of resistance. And they're firing indiscriminately. They're firing into homes. They had this policy of psychological warfare, which was essentially to leave communication on during the day and then to shut it off at night. So you know that when your communications go out, then that's when bad things start to happen and people start to get, taken away and disappeared. That doesn't seem to have worked very well. The on-the-ground people were organizing amongst themselves. They're creating, community self-protection groups. They were communicating through banging pots and pans rather than over the internet. But it became very, very resourceful in the continuing evolution of strategies. And of course, there are third factors involved and, foreign influences also. But all of this has led to the point where, I think the military is trying to figure out what it needs to do next. Does it just continue going up the escalation ladder, which it already seems to be doing? Now they seem to be deploying jets rather than simply, assault weapons. But also the question is, can the shadow government in exile, which still has not received any official recognition, can it pull together with the various ethnic armed organizations and build enough of a power base to force the Tatmadaw into negotiation? Or will it just be a continual brinksmanship? And as I said before, a crossfire hurricane? That remains to be seen.
It seems like when the military couldn't break the will of the protesters, that they ran into a problem. They've escalated to such a degree that the world seems to be almost unanimously against them. And like you said, the protesters and the signs, they're not in English anymore. They're very specific internally to this notion of resistance, meaning the bloodshed has basically alienated the military, not just from the world, but from various ethnic groups in the country itself. That's what it seems to be happening here. Are there any of the ethnic groups that are breaking on the side with the military? I remember, I think when we were talking last time, you made this point of saying the military was trying to make inroads with various ethnic groups because some of these guys are big militaries. It's their way of trying to consolidate power. Do you know if that has taken place?
Yeah. Yeah, this is the key question. And you're not going to understand Myanmar without understanding the history, but in particular the history of the relationships between the ethnic groups. Myanmar is a chimeric state that was built out of British colonialism and British decolonial process, which wanted to create, this kind of fractured monster, which has continued to serve the purposes that it was designed to serve, this continual divide and conquer, continuing, ethnic conflict. It's the world's longest running civil war. But once again, as you point out, the key question is, who's on which side? It's a complex map, but we can say in broad generalities that the Karen are on the side or against the military. And this makes sense because the Karen had been fighting the Burmese since 1949. It's almost continuous. They broke out in open warfare, and actually they were fighting the Burmese under British rule. They fought on the side of the British for 60 years against the Burmese. So they have a long history of, challenging the military. The other important ethnic minority organization, ethnic armed organization, are the Kachin. And the Kachin are taking the war directly to the Burmese military. For a period of about 17 years, they actually did have a ceasefire with the military. And this broke down because they realized that relationship with the military was essentially one of extractive capitalism, or what some scholars would call ceasefire capitalism.
KJ Noel is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at iacenter.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are in the wrap segment for today's show. That's right. You can call in now. We're waiting for you. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. And I think a good show so far today. One quick comment, and I don't want to co-opt Tarif, a normal caller of ours who may be bringing this up, but Stella Morris, Assange's partner, retweeted this on Twitter. This is coming out of Rome Reports, based in Italy. Basically, Pope Francis appears to have written a letter to Julian Assange while he's in prison. This came out, I believe, last night, yesterday at least. And in my opinion, that's big news. That's, from the international sort of optical standpoint, that's actually a pretty significant move in Assange's favor. I don't know, Pope Francis has questionable support among a lot of Catholics, but still, there are a lot of Catholics and a lot of people like Pope Francis and like the Pope in general. Anybody who's filling that role. So him voicing support for Julian Assange, even privately, since that's getting reported publicly, I think could be a big coup in Assange's favor. But without further ado, we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's on your mind, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. Free Julian Assange. That is a good thing, because I found that out yesterday, that the Pope sent a message through the priest at the prison to cheer up Julian Assange. That was a good thing for the Pope Francis to do that. That was a blessing. But that it does, that bring more spotlight on Julian Assange and other people and Catholics around the world. That's 1 billion people strong. That bring attention to him, because they say, well, who's Julian Assange? And they might do some research, so that'd be more support for Julian. Hopefully, that'll put more pressure on the AG to drop the charges. Hopefully, you know what I'm saying. And also, the prison. Hopefully, the judges let him go. And they can. Hopefully, they can drop the charges against him. But also, like I said last week, we still need an infrastructure program. Jackson, Mississippi with their water, and you got Flint, need their pipes change. Jackson, Mississippi, 125,000 people out, what I understand, is still out of water. So we need a major infrastructure program. That a jobs program that leads into an infrastructure program, a real infrastructure program. If not, things just going to get worse and worse and worse. But yeah, that's all I want to say, and free Julian Assange.
Tarif, thank you for the call. Agreed on freeing Julian Assange. Also agreed on some major infrastructure program. I'll put it like we've had this conversation before, even recently. We had a debate with Carmen Sabia last week on whether or not Biden's infrastructure plan was just a Green New Deal light. And there's back and forth on that with Republicans on that deal. Regardless, I think people across the board, whether you're talking to Democrats or Republicans, everybody believes we need some major infrastructure overhaul in this country. And so in a weird way, if you came up with the right plan, if it had the right content, and if you sold it in the right way, that seems like a pretty easy hurdle to jump when it comes to major policy improvements in the U.S. The problem, of course, is that if Biden's plan is too far to the left, and even if it's not, he's going to get hit by Republicans who want to dismiss it simply because it's coming from Biden. The same thing would have been held true for Trump, I believe. And therefore, with politics as divided as they are right now, it seems like unless you're talking about arming the military even more, spending billions or trillions more dollars on the MIC, you're unlikely to make much progress in the current political culture. But I'm in favor of it, and pretty much everybody in the country is. It's just a matter of specifics. And I wish politicians would get over themselves when it comes to the fate of our country and actually make some progress here. Am I being unfair there, Jamarl? What's your take?
Biden has the power to do whatever Biden wants right now. Let's be very clear. Biden is not the weakest man on the planet in the way that he often models himself. He has the House, he has the Senate, he has the presidency. That's all he needs. If Biden wanted to, he could pass that infrastructure plan. He could get rid of the filibuster right now. He could put his foot in the hampons of one Joe Manchin and anybody else who's basically backing or against him. Because you're right. If Joe Biden, who said he was going to do this, by the way, meaning the public was primed for this, comes out and says, look, we have an environmental problem and we're going to fix that environmental problem and we're going to solve it and we're going to put people to work doing it. Now, who's going to complain? We're going to make solar panels here in the United States. They're going to be uber efficient. And we're going to give free tax credits to anybody that is going to put them on their homes. We are even going to go further, and we're going to employ the people who are going to put them on their homes in this kind of public partnership or this worker co-op, so these people can get the money necessary for it. We are going to have a workers' militia who is going to go out and fix stuff in the country for beautification purposes. Like, do it! What is the negative? You're putting people to work. You're getting people a decent job. The job is specific to the country itself, meaning there's a certain degree of pride that's associated with the job as opposed to, putting the Slurpee thing. It's significant, and it's something that we can do, we need done. The bridges that need to be built, the Wi-Fi. I mean, think about all the things that we need, and think about for the moment, 25 trillion, the deficit? How much of that was spent on us? And how much of that was tax cuts and wars? Think about the money that was being spent as opposed to the money that should have been spent on us, our kids, and the things that we need in this country. Yes, jobs program. Do it. Why not? Because like you say, Shane, you say it all the time, we should have a specific purpose for our society. We are lurching in the dark. No point. And the point becomes, how much profit can you make? And is that really the point that you want to have for the entirety of your society that's kind of aggregated by each individuated unit of the consciousness as they pursue their profit or pursue their survivability apes? Should there not be a higher purpose? Think of the missile program, the space program. Think of the people that influence. Think of the careers that started because they were looking up to the sky, thinking about what they could be, what they could do, going to the other planets, building these equipment. It's a larger objective. I think that matters. I think we've lost that. And I'm not quite sure why we lost that. Am I missing it? I mean, you tell me, Shane. I mean, you often make this argument. And I agree with you on this.
I do. No, I do. And I don't want to get too into the weeds on the philosophy because we stay there and that gets boring after a bit. But I think it's easier for people to rally against things they don't like than it is for people to rally in favor of things they do. And, you can even say that what is politics right now, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, it is broadly pushing back on the ills that affect humanity, which is a good thing. But what we're talking about, if you're talking about a specific concrete positive vision, I don't mean just like emotionally positive, but literally one that has a specific stated goal other than merely fixing what's wrong in our society, you need to have a statesman or a leader or somebody to actually drive that push, and they need to have enough support, all this stuff. And here's the thing. I'll give you one example. This is the reigning technological example right now. If people are pushing for space travel, if people are pushing for the colonization of space, you're pushing for, this major, massive, expansion of humanity as a whole. All these technologies go along with that. It would be a big push, and that is a specific positive vision for humanity. In other words, it's not just fixing some ill, giving people healthcare or increasing people's liberty, whatever. As different variants of that, it is a specific vision. The problem with that is that as soon as you get into it, people start talking about how by doing that, you're ignoring all of the problems that we have to solve first. And that is the problem with any specific positive vision, any specific vision of where we can go as a society. But I mean, think back to, I'm not saying these should be held up as like the supreme example of how things can go, but think back for a second to all of the civilizations over the course of human history that have devoted a lot of time and attention and energy to building physical monuments, whether you're talking about the pyramids or the Eiffel Tower or the Colossus of Rhodes. or cathedrals. I mean, there are many examples. And admittedly, you can say, okay, those are wasteful. But part of what those do is they orient people's vision towards creating a physical representation of what that society is, what it looks like, and towards creating something beautiful, literally, for the society. And I'm not saying that we build a pyramid. That's not what I'm arguing for. But there is something that we have lost over the course of the centuries, over the course of decades maybe, where we're no longer pushing for that kind of thing. And that's not good for humanity. 202-521-1320. We might have enough time for another call after this. We got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey guys, good morning. To you guys are making some very good points right now, and I just think that we may have to consider, or we possibly should consider that the purpose as they see it is being served, is being accomplished. It's quite possible just off of what they're showing us. And what we've been shown is that the purpose is not to resolve these problems or solve these problems, but rather to the things that we would see as problems, anyways. But rather to grow these problems, because just listening to some of, and not on this particular episode, but listening to some of the things coming out of the monetary theory guys, some of the video works they've done, they talk about the accumulation of debt and how our government and our monetary system as it stands benefits from that debt, right? So with that in mind, one would have to consider the fact that this mass accumulation of debt is a part of the
Wait, Brave, real quick, just so people understand what you mean by that. You just mean every time the United States borrows money, we are borrowing that money, and we have to pay a certain amount of interest on that. The government could make greenbacks; they just choose not to make greenbacks. And you get into the whole 9 times, or the bank could take out 9 times the amount based on the $1 that they take out. So it's like they can loan $9 for every $1 that they get. It's a very weird financial system that we have, but it allows banks and the people lending that money to basically get interest on every dollar that we borrow. I'm sorry, Brave. Keep going.
Exactly. No, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And when you consider that that debt is used almost as leverage against us, right? So obviously they benefit from it, and they use it for the mysterious they use it for all of their wars and all the efforts and all the things that they benefit from. However, when the mass voices come together and scream for things like Medicare for all and whatnot, they turn around and use that same very debt that they've helped to accumulate to amass to argue us down and say, oh, well, we can't do that. We can't pay for that. Whereas we clearly can. You guys illustrated perfectly that the money and the power is there, because it's never a problem. We're talking about one. And I'll touch one other thing very quickly. So going into the elections, a point that was made was that, well, if we don't get those Senate seats, then the Biden administration will have to fight for for whatever they wanted. But we did get those Senate seats, right? It feels almost like Kirsten and I'm drawing a brain funk for the other Democrat.
Kirsten Sinema, and you're talking about Joe Manchin. We got to close it.
Manchin.
Yeah, in a couple seconds here, Brave. Where are you going with this?
They're carrying that weight as the heel against the Democratic position, or what it should be. But I'll leave it there.
Brave, thank you for the call. Astute as always. We got to close this show out, folks. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas. Thank you, Engineer Andre. Thank you to our guests, and thank you to our callers. And thank you, that is you, for listening to today's show. Have a great day, folks. We will be back tomorrow, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. As always, it is always appreciated. And I saw a chat. Let's see. Canada, $2,000 a month, free Medicare. But we don't attack brown people over here. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, you do. If I'm not mistaken, Canada is not necessarily free from its own issues of attacking brown people. But you're right, $2,000 a month, and healthcare. Look, we have to have a quick turnaround because we have another video coming up for Chris Williamson. He was supposed to be on earlier today, but there was a problem in the time. We were just I made a mistake within the context of the time. So I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say make sure you all are subscribed, and I will talk to you guys in 45 minutes. Thanks all. See you in a few.